I can still feel the crunch of snow underfoot, the chilling embrace of the winter air, and the unnerving silence of the forest. I've always considered myself a level-headed guy, practical, analytical. But what happened that winter in the forests of Horrifying County tested every ounce of logic I had. It started as a straightforward trip to escape the chaos of city life. I rented a cabin deep in the woods, hoping the isolation would help me reset. My job as a freelance writer meant long hours spent staring at screens, so the idea of no cell service and a roaring fireplace sounded like paradise. If only I'd known what waited for me. The drive into Horrifying was breathtaking. Snow-covered pines lined the winding road, and a frozen creek sparkled under the faint winter sun. The cabin, a small but sturdy structure, stood at the edge of a dense forest. It had everything I needed: a wood stove, a simple kitchenette, and a large window overlooking the wilderness. On my first night, the peace was intoxicating. The fire crackled as I sipped on coffee, watching snowflakes drift lazily past the window. For the first time in years, I felt truly alone, but not in a bad way. Until the sound started. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, a rhythmic thud echoing from the woods. At first, I dismissed it as a branch falling or perhaps the distant work of loggers. But the sound came again, louder this time, closer. The next morning, I decided to explore the forest. The fresh snow was pristine, untouched except for a strange set of tracks leading past the cabin. They weren't animal tracks, not even close. The prints were elongated, uneven, with deep impressions as if something impossibly heavy had walked there. Curiosity got the better of me, and I followed them. The tracks led to a clearing where the trees bent in unnatural ways, their trunks clawed as if by some enormous beast. Symbols were carved into the bark, circles intertwined with jagged lines. They radiated an eerie energy, making my skin crawl. Creepy, but probably some local kids messing around. I muttered aloud, trying to calm myself. Later that day, I met Leonard, an older man from a cabin down the road. He was hauling firewood when I introduced myself. His face grew tense when I mentioned the markings. "You saw them, didn't you?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, confused. "You need to leave. Tonight." "Why? What's the big deal?" Leonard hesitated, glancing nervously at the tree line. "There's something in these woods. We call it the White Howler. It's been here longer than any of us. It doesn't like visitors." He refused to say more, retreating to his cabin without so much as a goodbye. That night, the thudding sound returned, louder than before. It came from the clearing where I'd seen the markings. Against my better judgment, I grabbed a flashlight and ventured outside. The forest was deathly silent, except for the sound. As I approached the clearing, my flashlight flickered, then died. The darkness pressed in around me, suffocating. And then I saw it. A towering figure stood among the trees. Its body was skeletal, with branches woven into its flesh. Its face, or what passed for one, was a hollow void, an abyss that seemed to swallow the moonlight. The White Howler tilted its head, as if sensing my presence, and emitted a low, guttural sound. I froze, unable to look away. I don't remember how I made it back to the cabin, but I must have run faster than ever before. I slammed the door shut, bolting it as if that flimsy barrier could keep the creature out. The rest of the night was a blur of terror. The thudding continued, circling the cabin, punctuated by scratching at the walls. I didn't dare look outside. By morning, the forest was quiet again, but the damage was done. My mind raced with questions. What was the White Howler? Wanted to target me? And most importantly, how could I escape? I decided to leave, but the snowstorm had other plans. The roads were buried, and my car wouldn't start. Desperation drove me to Leonard's cabin, where I found him packing to leave. "You stayed too long," he said grimly. "Why is this happening? What is that thing?" Leonard sighed, his weathered face lined with fear. "The White Howler protects this forest. It hates intruders. Those markings you saw, they're warnings. It knows you're here now, and it won't stop until you're gone." That night, the White Howler came for me. Its thudding footsteps shook the cabin as it circled, its hollow face peering through the windows. I barricaded myself inside, clutching a fire poker like it would do any good. The creature's guttural noises grew louder, echoing in my mind. I don't know if it was fear or exhaustion, but I started hearing whispers, words I couldn't understand but felt compelled to obey. And then it was gone. By morning, the storm had cleared. I didn't waste a second packing up and leaving Raeline County. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw the white howler standing among the trees, watching me go. I'll never know what it wanted or why it let me leave. But one thing is certain, I'll never set foot in those woods again. Some places aren't meant to be explored. Some mornings are meant to be heated. And some creatures should be left alone. Weeks passed after my harrowing escape from Raeline County. Yet the memories clung to me like frostbite. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the white howler's void-like face and felt the oppressive silence of the forest. I thought leaving the woods would end its grip on me. I was wrong. Back home, I tried to bury myself in work, thinking distraction was the cure. But strange things began to happen. The first was subtle, a soft thud that echoed in the stillness of my apartment late at night. At first, I chalked it up to the old building settling. Then came the dreams. I find myself back in the clearing, surrounded by those clawed trees and haunting symbols. The white howler would emerge from the shadows, its skeletal body towering over me. In the dreams, it didn't just observe, it whispered. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear, a warning. One morning, as I struggled to shake off another sleepless night, my phone buzzed. It was an email from Leonard. Subject, it's not over. The message was brief, but chilling. I told you to leave, but you stayed too long. It knows you now. You need to come back. There's something I didn't tell you. Something you need to understand before it's too late. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to pretend Raeline was just a bad dream. But deep down, I knew Leonard was right. The white howler had followed me, its presence a shadow I couldn't escape. Reluctantly, I packed my bags and headed back to the winter forests of Raeline County. The drive felt surreal, like retracing the steps of a nightmare. When I arrived at Leonard's cabin, he was waiting, his expression grave. "You shouldn't have come back," he said, ushering me inside. "You're the one who told me to." I shot back. "Now tell me what's going on." Leonard sighed, pouring us both a cup of strong coffee. "The white howler isn't just some guardian spirit. It's tied to this land, yes, but it also preys on something deeper. It feeds on fear, on guilt. You must have given it something to latch onto." I frowned, unsure what he meant. "I didn't do anything to provoke it." "Didn't you?" Leonard countered. "Think carefully. Why did you go to that clearing? What were you looking for?" His words stirred something in me, a memory I'd buried long ago. Years earlier, as a teenager, I had visited Raeline with my older brother Davis. We camped not far from the cabin I stayed in during my recent trip. Davis had dared me to venture into the woods alone at night, bragging he'd done it before. I'd reluctantly agreed, but something had spooked me. A strange figure in the shadows, its hollow face watching me. I'd run back to camp, terrified, but Davis had dismissed it as my imagination. Only now did I realize the truth. The white howler had marked me back then. Returning to Raeline had simply reawakened its interest. Leonard nodded grimly when I recounted the memory. "That explains it. The white howler doesn't forget, but there's a way to sever its connection to you." He retrieved an old, weathered book from a chest. Its pages were filled with drawings of symbols like those I'd seen carved into the trees. "These are wards meant to protect against the white howler, but they only work if you face it directly." I didn't like the sound of that. "Face it? Are you saying I have to confront that thing?" Leonard nodded. "If you don't, it'll haunt you for the rest of your life. And it won't stop with dreams and noises. It'll consume you piece by piece." The ritual required a return to the clearing, now buried under even deeper snow. Armed with the book and a lantern, Leonard and I trudged through the forest. The air was heavy, the silence oppressive. "Stay close," Leonard warned. "It'll try to separate us." As we neared the clearing, The sudding began again, louder and more deliberate. Shadows danced at the edges of a lantern's glow, and the symbols on the trees seemed to shimmer. Then it appeared. The white howler emerged from the darkness, taller and more menacing than before. Its hollow face seemed to bore into my soul, and the air grew colder with each step it took. Leonard began chanting from the book, the symbols on the pages glowing faintly. The creature hesitated, its guttural noises rising in pitch. "Harley," Leonard called, "you have to speak to it. Tell it why you're here." My voice shook as I addressed the white howler. "I know you've marked me. I know I trespassed where I shouldn't have, but I'm not running anymore. Whatever it is you want, take it and leave me alone." The creature stopped, tilting its head as if considering my words. Then for the first time it spoke, or at least something spoke through it. "You carry guilt. Seer, they're mine." Images flooded my mind. Memories of times I'd run from responsibility, from challenges, from people I'd let down. The white howler wasn't just a creature of the forest. It was a manifestation of everything I'd avoided facing. Leonard's chanting grew louder, the symbols in the clearing glowing brighter. The white howler arrived, its skeletal form contorting as the light engulfed it. "Tarly," Leonard shouted, "speak your truth." "When it go?" Tears streamed down my face as I yelled into the void. "I'm done running. I'm done hiding. Take what you want, but you won't control me anymore." The white howler let out a deafening roar, its form dissolving into the shadows. The light from the symbols faded, and the forest fell silent once more. Back at Leonard's cabin, I felt lighter, as if a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had been lifted. Leonard clapped me on the shoulder. "You did good, kid. Not many can face the white howler and live to tell about it." As I drove away from Railline the next morning, I knew I'd never return. The white howler might have released me, but its lesson lingered. Some fears must be faced or they'll haunt you forever. And sometimes, the scariest monsters aren't the ones in the woods. They're the ones inside us. Driving away from Railline should have felt like freedom, a victory over something otherworldly. Instead, as the miles ticked by, a nagging unease lingered. The white howler was gone, or so I thought, but its presence still loomed in my mind. My hands trembled on the wheel as I tried to shake the feeling of being watched, even in the daylight. By the time I reached my home, the snow had begun to fall again, blanketing the streets in a quiet stillness. The weight of exhaustion hit me as I unlocked the door to my apartment. Inside, everything was just as I'd left it. Mundane, ordinary, and yet somehow foreign. That night, I stared at the ceiling for hours, waiting for sleep to claim me. But instead of rest, a faint sound stirred me, a hollow thud. I bolted upright, heart pounding. The noise was faint, as if it came from the walls themselves. "Duh," he whispered up. "It's over." But the sound came again, louder this time. It wasn't the rhythmic pounding of the white howler from the forest. It was more deliberate, almost beckoning. Gripping a flashlight, I swept through the apartment, searching for the source. Nothing was out of place, no sign of an intruder. Yet the sound persisted, leading me to the small storage closet at the end of the hallway. My throat tightened as I opened the door. Inside was nothing but a stack of old boxes. Still, the sound was louder now, reverberating from the farthest corner of the closet. I moved the boxes aside, revealing a wall covered in faint, claw-like scratches. Scratches that hadn't been there before. Panicked, I called Leonard. His voice was calm, but grim. "You didn't leave everything behind, Harley," he said. "The white howler doesn't just disappear. It leaves traces, echoes of its presence. You might have broken its hold on you, but you didn't erase it." "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. "It means it's still tied to you in some way," Leonard explained. "You need to find the source of its lingering connection and sever it completely." Determined to rid myself of the white howler's shadow, I began to dig through everything I'd brought back from Railline. Clothes, boots, even my camera. That's when I found it. The notebook I'd used to sketch the symbols in the clearing. The pages were warped from moisture, the ink smudged. But as I flipped through, I noticed something new. Faint, jagged lines etched into the paper, forming the same eerie patterns I'd seen on the trees. "Is this it?" I murmured aloud. I called Leonard again, describing the notebook. He was silent for a moment before replying. "That's the tether. It's acting as a conduit, keeping the white howler connected to you. You need to destroy it. But not here." "Where then?" I asked. "In the woods," Leonard said. "Back in its domain. It's the only way to end this for good." The thought of going back to Raeline made my stomach churn, but I knew Leonard was right. Armed with a notebook, a small fireproof container, and a bag of supplies, I headed out once more. The winter storm had worsened, and by the time I reached the outskirts of the forest, the roads were nearly impassable. I parked my car and continued on foot, the biting wind cutting through my coat. The forest felt different this time, quieter, heavier, as if it were holding its breath. As I approached the clearing, I was startled by a figure emerging from the trees. It was Leonard, bundled in a heavy coat and carrying his own supplies. "I figured you'd need help," he said with a wry smile. "Glad to see you're not letting me face this alone," I replied, though my relief was tinged with unease. Together, we set up a small campfire in the clearing, the flames casting flickering shadows on the snow. Leonard laid out the book of symbols again, instructing me on the final steps of the ritual. "You'll need to burn the notebook here," he said, "but the white howler won't let it go easily. Be ready." As the notebook's edges caught fire, the forest erupted in sound. The familiar thudding returned, this time faster and more erratic. The shadows around us deepened, twisting and shifting as the white howler appeared once more. It didn't hesitate this time. It lunged toward the fire, its skeletal arms reaching for the notebook. "Harley, keep it burning!" Leonard shouted, holding up a warning symbol to keep the creature at bay. I fed more kindling into the flames, willing the notebook to burn faster. The white howler screeched, a guttural sound that seemed to vibrate through my very bones. "You cannot escape," it hissed, its hollow face inches from mine. Just as the notebook turned to ash, a blinding light erupted from the fire. The white howler recoiled, its form disintegrating into wisps of shadow. The symbols around the clearing glowed brilliantly, sealing the creature's presence away. The silence that followed was deafening. Leonard and I stared at the dying fire, the notebook now nothing more than charred fragments. "It's done," Leonard said quietly. The walk back to the car was eerily peaceful. The forest, once oppressive and cold, now felt almost serene. The air was lighter, the shadows less threatening. Back in town, I dropped Leonard off at his cabin and thanked him for everything. He simply nodded, his eyes tired but satisfied. As I drove away, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't experienced in years. The white howler was gone, its hold on me finally broken. But as I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror, I noticed something, a faint symbol barely visible, etched into the corner of my eye. Perhaps the white howler was truly gone. Or perhaps, like all shadows, it was simply waiting for the right moment to return. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the wind against the window seemed louder, sharper. My mind raced, replaying the events in Raeline over and over again. The white howler was gone, or so Leonard and I believed, but the faint symbol etched into my reflection lingered like a bad dream. By morning, I convinced myself it was paranoia. Perhaps I'd been staring too hard, letting my fear conjure things that weren't there. Still, the thought gnawed at me. Shadows had a way of creeping back when least expected. 2 weeks passed. Life returned to some semblance of normalcy. The snow in the city had melted, giving way to slushy streets and gray skies. I threw myself into work, desperate to occupy my thoughts. Then one evening my phone buzzed. It was Leonard. "Harley," he said, his voice tense, "we have a problem." "What kind of problem?" I asked, already dreading the answer. "There's been activity in Raeline," he said. "People have gone missing near the woods. It's starting again." I closed my eyes, gripping the phone tighter. "It can't be. We destroyed the tether." "I thought so too," Leonard said, "but it's not just a white howler anymore. Something else is stirring, something bigger. I wanted to refuse, to tell Leonard to handle it on his own, but deep down, I knew I couldn't walk away. Whatever was happening in Railline, I was part of it now. The forest had its claws in me, and ignoring it wouldn't make it go away. The drive back felt heavier than before, as if the air itself resisted my return. Snow blanketed the highway again, and by the time I reached Railline, night had fallen. Leonard met me at his cabin, his face lined with worry. "You look terrible," I said, trying to lighten the mood. "So do you," he shot back, though his attempt to humor fell flat. He handed me a map, marked with red circles around various parts of the forest. "These are the spots where people disappeared, all near the old clearing." "Of course," I muttered. The clearing. We set out at dawn, armed with supplies and a sense of grim determination. The forest was eerily silent, the only sound our boats crunching through the snow. The air was colder than it should have been, biting through our layers. As we approached the clearing, I felt it, a familiar heaviness, a sense of being watched. Leonard must have felt it too, because he stopped abruptly, scanning the trees. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. I strained my ears. At first, there was nothing. Then, faintly, the sound of laughter, high-pitched childlike, echoed through the trees. "Kids?" I asked, my stomach nodding. "No," Leonard said, his voice tight. "Not kids." The laughter grew louder, circling us. Shadows flickered at the edge of my vision, darting between the trees. My breath quickened as the temperature seemed to plummet. "Stay close," Leonard said, gripping his talisman tightly. We reached the clearing, but it was no longer empty. Standing in the snow were figures, small, childlike shapes, their features obscured by shadows. They didn't move, didn't speak, but their presence was suffocating. "What are they?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Echoes," Leonard said. "Fragments of the forest's victims." One of the figures took a step forward, its head tilting unnaturally to the side. Then another step forward, in another. They moved in unison, their hollow eyes fixed on us. "Leonard," I said, backing away. "What do we do?" Before he could answer, the laughter returned, louder and more distorted. The figures broke into a run, rushing toward us. Leonard thrust his talisman forward, chanting under his breath. A burst of light erupted from the talisman, sending the figures scattering like smoke. "Rot!" Leonard shouted.